So generally, I come to this as a historian of Southeast Asia, but I didn't start off that way. A lot of my undergraduate degree was in European history, a little bit of African and Middle East history, no Asia at all. And I came to Asia really in my graduate studies and in kind of living and working in Southeast Asia. So I'm coming to this in a very different way in which a lot of my students are. And I think it's important to recognize one's positionality and where you are, how you're coming to this topic, how others are coming to this, what kinds of, knowing how much they've learned, how much imperial history they've had. I always ask them, my students, about, whether they learned about empire in their GCSEs or A levels. And often I get about 10% that really took a course on empire. And it's really, quite low, I think, and it shouldn't be that low. So I think that we do have to recognize their position, our position, and where we're coming from and how we, in terms of how we teach. I think that, I think it's important that there are also, I also come to this as a historian of decolonization, especially more recently in the past few years. And I think it's important to remind others. I know that the movement to kind of decolonize the curriculum is an absolutely crucial one in terms of critiquing Eurocentrism, to critiquing whiteness, and bringing to light issues of race, as just mentioned. But I also think it's important to remind people about the long and complex history of decolonization all around the world. That this is really something that is lived and real and experienced in very different ways. And that's something that I try to bring to my students in my teaching.
I think for public history, this is actually quite an interesting question, because in a way, the sort of one of the central questions for certainly the research around public history, but also a lot of the practice, is that question of whose public history. And in a way, that has been central to the subject of public history, not always, but certainly in the last sort of 30, 40 years. And so in a way, it's always been part of the praxis to think about whose histories are told, whose are omitted, from whose perspective history is talked about and represented. And I think what we're seeing is a much more complex way of asking those questions that isn't just about the grand narratives that do or do not make it into the public sphere, but is actually about things like, well, who gets to be part of the process in the first place? So we're seeing much more of a turn to processes of co-production and co-creation, where we are making histories together and with different groups of people. And I think what we will see much more of is a deconstruction of those processes as well, and sort of critical reflection on what we're doing and who gets to be sort of part of that process as well. So I think for me, it's about that process of deconstruction, of always asking who is a part of this and who is not a part of this, whose perspective is included and how. But I think just taking a point from Sue Lynn's approach as well, public history is also something that I think should be, and perhaps hasn't been enough, talked about as a part of a global conversation, because there is a global network of public historians, of practice of public history, and I think the tendency in universities in the UK has been to think about public history as local history, and there's a reason for that. It often comes out of the local history centres that have now closed down and become public history or heritage centres, but it's important, I think, to think about this in a much more global way and take on those different perspectives. And I hope that that's something we can try to build into our degree program a lot more.
Yeah. I think just to add to that, I know this is a question about teaching, but this kind of plays into research as well, in terms of how we conduct our research, especially for me, what I tended to do, what most historians would tend to do in terms of how we do our field work and studying Asia or going out, when we're based in especially when we're based in kind of Western, Northern, Global North universities, is kind of going out to the region, doing our field work, doing a lot of oral histories, collecting materials, bringing them back, and kind of writing our grand histories from there. And I think one thing that I'm quite interested in doing, which I'll be doing with my next project, is it kind of plays off another project I had where we had researchers working in an archive together, and for a week. And, rather than having a lone historian doing their work, really having a group of people. And with my next project, I'm actually bringing public historians, scholar activists from Southeast Asia to archives in Europe, where we can all kind of work together, share our material, and making them really kind of actors in the process, in a way that they can write their own histories, that they are empowered to write these histories with access to archives in the global north.
I think that's a really good point, in that it's slightly artificial to separate teaching and research in this conversation as well, because we're working in universities, and a lot of our teaching is research led. And also I think that part of the way we can develop this further is maybe incorporating more of those processes and methodologies that we're using in our research and developing in decolonized ways into the teaching practice as well, and kind of, rather than sort of waiting for there to be, as sometimes happens, doing the research, publishing the research, and then teaching the research, that we have more of the teaching at the very beginning of that process, and are open and honest with students about the problems, the challenges that we have at the very beginnings of trying to work in a different and more decolonial way.